My name is Michael Lynch. I'm the director of the Humanities Institute, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you virtually to the UConn Humanities Institute. In this moment, when many of us are working in different places and meeting remotely, we acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are gathered and of the lands where remote participants are currently working. And we recognize their continuing connection to the land, to the waters, and culture. We pay respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. We have an excellent event for you today. Here today with us on the virtual stage is Professor Laura Mauldin, who is a professor of women, gender, and sexuality studies and human development and family sciences at the University of Connecticut. Laura is currently writing a book about caregiving in the US that tells the intimate stories of spousal caregivers and their disabled partners' lives to reveal how ableism shapes the US care crisis, but also how people create and build accessible worlds, meaningful worlds, in order to survive. Sherie Randolph has been scheduled to be the commentator for this, but we're having some technical difficulties. So I'm just going to go ahead and turn it over to Laura, who is our main speaker for today. And she is going to, I'm just absolutely delighted to welcome her to the virtual stage. Laura, take it away.
Thank you so much, Michael. I want to just thank you so much for that introduction and thank the Humanities Institute for supporting this project. And thanks to the Access team, we've got interpreters and a captioner and the tech team whom I've asked to put a link in the chat to a document that has all the image descriptions for the slides that you can access whenever it's good for you. And I will describe myself. I'm a apparently middle-aged white woman now, and I have curly dark hair. And before I get into content, I want to talk really briefly about process and about what I thought this project was going to be and how it's turning out. So I made my own fun meme mashup here. This image shows a white man sort of dressed in all black, very smartly, with the text, how it started. And he's looking over at another white man surrounded by a giant swarm of pink feather boas with the text, how it's going with that one. And so I started this project as a very traditional qualitative research project, guided by the aim of better understanding the lives and experiences of spousal caregivers, and when possible, their partners as well. So I designed a protocol. I obtained funding from the Social Science Research Council. I conducted 2 interviews each with 44 spousal caregivers across 22 states and a dozen or so policy experts and community activists. And I have nearly 100 interviews to work with. And this was followed by visiting a subset of 4 couples in 4 different states for observations, including overnight stays in some cases. Participants also sent me 500 photos, images of items that they use in caregiving, from sophisticated medical technologies to repurposed household objects. I wanted to document how people are creating livable and accessible worlds at home. And so I also have a grant to support a website for the photos to serve as a community archive to share disability hacks, right? So as you might imagine, I have mountains of data waiting for coding and analysis, and I'm sure I could write any number of social science papers from this, and I will someday, but I'm here to talk about the book, which is what I'm most moved to do and what the Humanities Institute is so generously supporting. So how's it going? At this point, I'm now in the middle of this unruly, deeply personal, and hopefully beautiful, and at times also heartbreaking thing that I want to make. And frankly, I found myself unable to execute this project within the parameters of my training in sociology. Instead, I found myself guided more by intuition and feeling, and digging into the tensions that was bringing to the fore, given my training. So in some ways, I took a Louis Kahn approach, which of course Kahn is the famous architect who, when thinking about what form a structure he was going to design should take, he would turn to his materials and ask, what do you want, brick? And so because I found myself bringing my own experience as a caregiver for my late partner to this work, I found myself in a similar position, asking similar questions of the material. What is the best, or what is at the heart of the stories? Where does their force lie? And what's the best way to bring this to readers? And how can my own story amplify the other stories? And I was also thinking about how Roxane Gay so beautifully articulates that when we're writing about trauma, which was certainly present in my story and other people's stories, is that we have to ask ourselves, what is it that people need to hear? So all of this meant letting go of ingrained, very deeply ingrained and rigid sociological parameters, and instead prioritizing a commitment to the story that needs to be told. So I'm making some unconventional choices about what counts as material and how the materials should be molded together. So this image shows several planes flying across the sky in orderly lines, while one plane is taking a very different route and crossing diagonally against them. So I'm writing this general audience book, and it fully embraces the personal and the evocative. This is in contrast to how we academics are usually trained to only value the quote unquote neutral and explicative. So I do rely on what we might call data, but I also engage in more literary and at times poetic forms even. And I'm doing that because at the center of the book is a striving to better understand one of the most difficult parts of our humanity, which is experiencing and caring for these unreliable bodies that we all live in. So how could I possibly achieve that goal without incorporating honesty and vulnerability, heartbreak and grief, creativity and survival? I couldn't see how to do it without that. So the plan is to use short alternating chapters to braid together 3 different elements. I'll have personal narrative or memoir, in-depth storytelling of 2 to 3 participants, and accessibly written essays that surface the larger forces and ideologies that shape the stories across the book. So there'll be several essays throughout, but today I'm just going to focus on one of them. So just a quick pause because I couldn't help myself. The sociologist in me won't let me not pause here. So the book is unconventional and the rest of this talk will be too, but I thought it important to say that if I was doing a traditional sort of sociological talk or book, I would start with the following context. And I'll just tell you a few facts here. 6 out of 10 US adults have a chronic condition. That's the majority. 4 in 10 have 2 or more. 26% of the US adult population is disabled. We have no universal health care. Our home care and long-term care situation is even worse. Contrary to popular belief, Medicare does not cover long-term care, and Medicaid, which does have home and community-based services, is next to impossible to qualify for and is implemented differently across all 50 states. So in the absence of a social safety net, we rely on 53 million and climbing unpaid family caregivers in the US, the majority of whom are women. And the other context here that's important is that with ever more sophisticated technologies, millions of people are living longer with more complicated and technologically complex care needs than ever before. So this is what family caregivers are taking on. So if this was a regular sort of sociology talk, I would sort of give you my literature review and go over my methodology and present my findings in this very thematic fashion. But don't worry, I'm not going to do any of that. Instead, I made my own Drake hotline bling meme. So this image is a quadrant, and the top image shows Drake with a facial expression of disgust with his hand up at the text that reads sociological norms, rigid sociological norms, while the bottom image shows him smiling with his head back in the text box, writing with feeling. So here's what we're going to do for the rest of the talk. I'm going to present some of the key ideas from the opening essay of the book. That essay is titled Our Anti-Body Politic, and it appears after the prologue, where I tell the story of how my late partner and I met, fell in love, and the prologue ends with the moment not too long after where she tells me that her leukemia has returned. Then after I talk about the key ideas from the essay, I'll read a short piece that I'm calling Public Display of Affection. So I want to first say that the phrase body politic, of course, refers to this idea of a collective, that we're all part of a larger body politic, a larger collective. That's one layer to this. But the other layer is the idea that our society is against bodies. So I'll elaborate. We inhabit unreliable bodies and we don't like to talk about it. For example, we might think it's better to hide a painful knee or other joint by refusing to limp, no matter how much it might hurt to do so, or refuse to use a cane in favor of being able to do it on my own, even if it hurts. We often mask our own needs and also the needs of the people that we care for when it veers into the territory of disability. And we don't hide disability or shy away from talking about the caregiving that we do in a vacuum. Instead, we do this because the social messaging is that disabled bodies are shameful, pitiable, and even contemptible. And by extension, needing care is all of these things too. And so like many shameful and devalued things do, disability and care have largely been pushed across into the domain of the private. And rendering something private does a few things. It disappears the ongoing acts of care that people engage in every single day behind closed doors. And it renders both disabled people and caregivers invisible. And lastly, it creates a mirage of what constitutes the public. In disappearing all of that into the private, productivity, independence, and autonomy come to stand in for the norm, for real life, while disability and care are maintained as atypical or deviant or outside of real life, when of course they're not. Disability is the norm, and we all live in our unreliable bodies. So how did we get here? How did we end up with such an anti-body politic? I'm thinking about the ways about how in this society we worship at the altar of autonomy and independence, and therefore needing care symbolizes everything that we don't want to be. This means that our value as individuals is shaped precisely by our capacity to not need. So in this game of who can need the least, power and status emerge when you are able to obscure a need for care. Of course, normal care needs, typical care needs like eating and sleeping are mostly acceptable, but we don't treat people with illness or disability the same way. Those kinds of needs are seen as extra, and this can render someone suddenly worth less. And this is our anti-body politic. Instead of facing the calamity that is the denial of our care needs, or even understanding that that is a calamity, we usually opt to distance ourselves from it. We avoid those people who can't contain their need for care. We think of them as somehow too sad, too other, and we may not even notice that we do this because independence and autonomy are so sacred that the shame of needing care is utterly unremarkable. So as a result, we largely don't know how to make sense of disability and care in ways that aren't filled with shame and pity or the diminishment of others. We don't see the need for care or disability as a collective experience, but rather we view it as an individual tragedy. But it's not. We are all our bodies and we're all in relation to each other. But we continue to perpetuate a culture where this is not recognized and where we don't build systems to address that. So what happens when we inevitably find ourselves facing disability? What happens when we inevitably find ourselves called upon to care for someone that we love? And I believe our anti-body politic leaves us in a void with little to draw from, both culturally and structurally. So by culturally, I mean the way that society ignores the ubiquity of illness and disability and care, the way that we don't value the hidden caregiving that gets done or take seriously the knowledge and culture of disability communities. We mostly don't even know that disability communities even exist, yet they have long existed. Just like any other community of oppressed people, these communities help each other survive. But because we don't talk about it, it's a leap for people to even see disability as social or as a potential site of knowledge. By not having a lot to draw from structurally, I mean that people are left to fend for themselves when it comes to meeting care needs. We don't recognize that we are in a collective. We don't build systems that are friendly to disabled people. Our systems are, for example, trying to get Social Security disability income. They're burdensome and hostile, and often, most people are denied. We also don't have strong safety nets in terms of care, right, that allow disabled people to live in their homes with support. And again, instead, we rely on family members, and as I've mentioned, that are the majority of whom are women. Meanwhile, the alarm has been sounded again and again about how we must address this care crisis. And feminists argue that the problem is that care is devalued because it's primarily done by women. So since we devalue women, we expect them to provide care for free because we've rendered it this private concern, and the private or domestic sphere is the location of women's unpaid work. While that's true, our care crisis is not just a result of sexism. We can also look over at paid home care, and we can see that home health aide jobs are some of the lowest paid jobs that exist in the US with the highest turnover rates. At the same time, the Bureau of Labor Statistics predicts that the demand for home health aides is going to outpace every single other occupation over the next decade. And the terrible labor conditions and low pay aren't just about sexism, they're also about racism. The majority of home health aides are women of color. And this is the legacy of the New Deal, which was passed in 1933, when domestic and farm workers were specifically excluded from labor protections, precisely because those are jobs largely filled by people of color. So these exclusions still apply in the paid home care sector. So both racism and sexism play into why our care systems are precarious and inadequate, but what we don't talk about is how our anti-body politic is the expansive, poisonous root of the crisis. We devalue care because we devalue the people who need it. The ideology that informs the devaluation of disabled people, and that is at the heart of our anti-body politic, is ableism. And ableism is the idea that non-normative bodies are worth less. Ableism says your worth and your value are directly reflected in your capacity for quote unquote independence, or to be perceived as quote unquote contributing. In this sense, ableism is everywhere. But it stems from our history in the US of eugenics and anti-Black racism. So there's a whole section in the book where I'll talk about the connections between that, but you need to only think about the stereotypes and beliefs that we are sold about which people are quote unquote takers from the system. And we see all of that spread into attitudes about disabled people as well, and particularly disabled people of color. So those are its roots, but ableism also stratifies each and every one of us, regardless of our disability status. It's simple. If you are able-bodied, you are seen as worth more. If you are not, you're seen as worth less. And your worth will go up or down as your disability status intersects with other social locations you occupy, like race or gender. So what I want to focus on in the book, and what I spend time doing, is talking about what does ableism do to care? And part of that is that it flattens us on either side of it. On the one side, it places disabled people as stereotyped as passive entities, only takers, rather than whole people contributing to the world, who may also be providing care to those around them, and who are complex human beings just like everyone else. On the other, caregivers are assumed to be able-bodied, even as the unsustainable demands upon them are themselves disabling. Home health aides are frequently disabled by their work, and the majority of family caregivers report depression, PTSD, and physical strain. Finally, ableism puts individual caregivers in the position of standing in for an absent system, and it cheers them on as heroes or saints for doing so. In this context, caregivers also cannot be complex people like everyone else. When we expect them to carry the weight of all of the structural abandonment of disabled people, and we celebrate their Herculean efforts as they do so, it means that caregivers may only be seen as heroes or angels until they break. I've found that if they can't or don't want to do it anymore, if they collapse under the strain, they can easily be seen as selfish or evil. So these are the main ideas that I discuss in the opening essay. And what I hope to convey is that ableism fuels the unsustainable conditions on either side of caregiving. And I also argue that the care crisis stems from our refusal to value disabled people, and by extension, the people caring for them. So in short, our anti-body politic is the care crisis. So that's the main ideas from the first opening essay of the book, which I think is the most expansive framing for the book as compared to the other essays. But now for the last few minutes of my time, I'm going to read aloud a shortened version of a love letter that I have written to the participants, which will also be in the book. And I'm reading this for a few reasons. First, because it reveals some, though not all, of the salient themes that characterize the participants' lives, but also because it wholeheartedly embraces my emotional response and connections to them, because I believe that researching and writing care should not exclude expressing it. And because there are caregivers and disabled people in this virtual room, this is for you too. And because only through public displays of affection can we counter our anti-body politic. So I'll read the letter, and that will close out my talk today. Dear you, all the advice out there about how to write a love letter says that the writer should be vulnerable, that they should be coming from a place of deep feeling. And that works for me because, well, I'm emotional about you. There, I said it. The fact is, I'm smitten. I know I shouldn't be, and I know I'm breaking the rules. In interviews, you shared the story of your relationship, of falling in love, and then we talked about the details of your day-to-day life, even your most intimate daily routines. I even visited some of you, and you fed me, and you gave me a place to sleep. You wrapped me up in your linens, a quilt passed down through generations of your family. You set the table and included a seat for me. You invited me to stay for a game of cards. You told me your secrets. You made me fruit salad. You made me pasta. You sent me photos and well wishes, and you emailed me to make sure that I got home okay. You're each the impetus for this love letter. Whether you are a caregiver or the person cared for, and let's face it, we are often both. You moved me. So this is my public love letter to you. To my most beloved fellow humans with a body, I want the world to know your value. I hope that this public display of affection opens up the possibility for a shift from I care to we care. So let us, in this public declaration of love, scale up. We can build relationships with one another as we read together out loud this love letter. The first time you and I spoke, I saw you on screen, your camera angled down at you from a high shelf. Like so many other participants, you looped around in your story, time folded in on itself over and over. You held so much information in your head, medications and treatments, hospitalization dates. And the next time we spoke, you called me from a parking lot, curled up in the front seat of your parked car, and you said with confession in your voice after a very long pause, Laura, I have to tell you something. I could hear you shift uncomfortably in your seat. Okay, I said. You proceeded to tell me about your affair. You told me about the feeling of being held, of being attended to just for a short while. You were rejuvenated. You also told me quickly and profusely that you love your husband, but that you were wilting inside. And I heard the distance that you hold inside you between what you really want for this to not be happening to your husband or to you, and what you must do to survive it. Later, you sent me photos, and I could see how you caressed him multiple times a day. You also suctioned his mucus, and we looked at pictures of the suction machine together, and we talked about it. And you sent me photos of him gaunt and gray, but you also sent photos of the two of you happy, cheeks pressed together, wrinkled, and smiling. What is the shape of your love, and how expansive can it be? You said sometimes you have to leave his world, but that you come back again and again. You see, you told me, there is nothing wrong with his heart or his lungs, so this could go on for years. But you also told me that no matter how much of a caregiver you are, no matter how much you do, the minute you cheat, other people will think that you are nothing, that you are a horrible person, that it cancels it all out, negated. And so you told no one. I too did things I'm ashamed of to survive caregiving. I too sit with the monster that is weaponized regret. And I ask again, what is the shape of love? How expansive can it be? To care is complicated. To receive it is too. And all I can think now is that there are so many rules and assumptions that it can break us and limit us in what we consider to be the shape of love. I did not say any of this to you on the phone, but I felt a profound sadness and a longing to comfort you. I saw you in all of your cognitive dissonance and all the struggle, and I held it close and I sat with it. At the end of the call, you said in your confession voice again that you felt like you were a bad person, but I did not see a bad person. You were just trying to fill the well, trying to keep it all together. And I want you to know you were not the only person who made such a confession to me. There were so many more of you than you might imagine. You told me about falling asleep in the elevator. You were on the other side of your own cancer treatment and trying to keep your husband alive. But you were so tired, you couldn't even make it the few floors up to your husband's hospital room before falling asleep, standing up right there in the elevator. And then you took a deep breath and told me harrowing and gruesome details of cleaning your husband's recurring wounds, which are so deep that his tendons are often exposed. You are alone, fighting, slashing, and marching your way, exhausted, not just through the blood and gore, but also through the mountains of insurance paperwork. I see you falling apart, and yet you cannot, because there are no other options. I don't want to let go of your metaphorical hand from a distance. Do you know this? You may not know that I am thinking of you, but I am. You were convinced you were a waste. You told me how badly you did not want to be, quote, one of them. You did not want to need a scooter. You did not want to be friends with the other kids with a disability like yours. You told me about practically being knocked down in the grocery store while you held your cane, people brushing past you unthinkingly, too close. Any kind of tipping could throw you off balance, but you said people just didn't care, that they stared, that you thought you might be pathetic and not worth staying married to. Now that you're no longer earning a paycheck, you thought you were just a drain. When you used your disability parking placard, people stared, evaluating you as if they were in a position of authority over you. You wanted them to mind their own business, but you still absorbed all of that disdain. It was just too easy for you to believe that you were worthless now, and my heart broke. You're not worthless. You're not the burden. You can be disabled. You can be, quote, one of those people and still be worth something. Has anyone ever told you that? Because you sat there with me in your living room, berating yourself. And hours later, we tinkered around in your garage and you showed me how you were finding ways to do things at home, things that I immediately thought other people would want to know. You have knowledge, and what I saw was brilliance and creativity. Somewhere, someone might need the YouTube instructional how to mount a striker plate in a door jamb when you have the use of only one hand. So no, you did not want to become one of them, but you found yourself face to face with it. When you talked to me about how it felt, I nodded and I listened, but I wanted to reach across the room and hold you and tell you not to be ashamed. You're not a failure. You're just being asked to make sense of an experience that we don't give people a way to make sense of. The tears fell off your cheeks and onto your shirt, and you wiped them with the back of what you call your, quote, good hand. But I wanted to tell the bad side of your body that it was still good too, that it's yours, still here, it's you. You have a unique and valuable way of being in the world that's specific to who you are and the things you love. You love your cats. You love your tools. You love cooking. You love building things. You like to play the slots. You are funny and you love to crack jokes. You survived another day in the world that doesn't make it easy. You're not the worthless person that you think you are. You called me from the rehab facility and told me you'd gone into heart failure. You were sobbing because you could no longer bend over to tie your own shoes. You were weak and worried, telling me how the years of caring for your husband alone had been slowly killing you. But you still cracked a joke about how maybe your husband could put his laundry in the dishwasher. That, you said, laughing, he might be able to do. The fact was, there was no one else to care for him. But how could you do it now in the state you're in? And you raged. Your rage wasn't directed at me, but you let it rip. Curse words spewing out of your mouth, the spit I could practically hear flying in the air on the other side of the phone. You raged at her illness, at a system that, in your words, is just so fucked up. Indeed, it is. Your anger exploding let me know that you're still a whole person and that we all carry our sadness in different ways. Of course, there's still so much I don't know about you. I don't know the other parts of your lives. Plus, there's so much we don't share: age, location, even political beliefs. But I still feel for you. So yes, I am aware of the limits around how we know each other, but I still want to reach for you. You showed me so much that I want to give you something in return. And I want to tell you that because you're so deep in the middle of it all, full of urgent caregiving information, it can take over your mind. Trust me when I tell you later, you may not remember it all. You may not remember the day-to-day, the medication dosages, the treatment plans. These may disappear. But I hope you see that there is so much more to you. So let this letter help to hold your story, your record, the magnificent and complicated traces of you. Love, me. So that's the end.
All right. Thank you so much, Laura. That was deeply moving and affecting. I'm very pleased now to be able to welcome Sherie Randolph, who is going to be our discussant for today. Sherie is professor of history. Yep. And she is professor of history at the Georgia Institute of Technology and a fellow at the Humanities Institute this year. She's the founder of the Black Feminist think tank. And her first book, Florence Flo Kennedy, The Life of a Black Feminist Radical, examines the connections between Black power, civil rights, New Left, and the feminist movements. And she's currently working on her second book, Bad Black Mothers, bad in quotes, A History of Transgression. Sherie, it's wonderful to welcome you to the virtual stage of the Humanities Institute, and please take it away.
I'm not going to speak long because I know people have a lot of questions because this is a very evocative subject. I remember when Laura spoke at the beginning of our fellowship, I had so many questions. I'm like, wait. I need to know more. I hadn't thought about this. So I'm going to start with just reading a little bit of how I kind of saw the piece that Laura sent me, and also some of the things that she spoke about. So thank you, Laura, for this really inspiring and emotional and loving project. From your presentation and the introduction and love letter I've read, I'm excited about the completed manuscript, and I'm glad that you found a way to merge the scholarly, because I do think, because you still use footnotes and you're still trying to contextualize a lot of the terms and theories and competing attitudes that are going on. So I still see the sociologist in you, but you're also trying to, what I feel is also a little bit of cultural studies as well, to try to deeply read and experience and deeply be careful with it and be sensitive with the lives and interviews you've been given. So I will start by organizing my thoughts around what I think the book offers for not only numerous people, as you say in the introduction that you that you let me read, directly experiencing the burden of caregiving, but also researchers and practitioners in various fields, from women's studies and health and public policy and Black studies and history, all I think can deeply connect with this book and utilize it. One of the profound possibilities in your work is it attempts to make sense of a multi-layered structural problem that is profoundly personal and everyday implications. And we can find that in many things, but I think this, the example of caregiving, if it doesn't affect you now, it will. Do you know, either you're gonna, you'll have to at some point, unless you just, even if you ignore it, it's affecting you. It's affecting the people around you. It's affecting the people you work with. And you make that clear, like it's everywhere, but seemingly private or pushed into the private realm. And I want to talk later, one of my questions will be, but are body politics? And I wondered if you debated about that, because it's the royal we, the royal R, you know, you're setting up society in a way that we are all implicated or some way affected or shared in that. And so I would love for you to talk about how you came up with that, or how you see this R, because R isn't always the state in the way you use it either. It's sometimes a loving R, do you know? Sometimes a hopeful R, and sometimes it's we're all oppressed R, do you know? Because a lot of the people that you're interviewing might have some wealth or something in one category, but having to be a caregiver, and you focus on spouses, which I think it's really important to underline too, like this isn't mother to child or, you know, parent to child, or it's really two people who should be aging at the same time and are thrown off track and by whatever neglect through society. So there's two quotes that really stood out to me. Being able-bodied just means your needs are considered within the realm of normal, typical, usual. And that can stand in, I see how you're setting this up for race and so many other things, like whiteness becomes the norm, able-bodied becomes the norm. But we don't treat those illnesses or disability the same way. Those kinds of needs are extra. And I thought about it, I'm like, that's true. You know, if you're sick, you're all of a sudden you argue the calculus of your life, your body, your worth is a deficit. And simply put, you say, this is our anti-body politics. And then you go down and we say, we may even denigrate those who need care as pathetic takers. And that's true. Even, you know, bilking the system, and you point out how Social Security, Medicare, how it's practically, you're highly policed. You have to get a lawyer. You have to be highly sophisticated to even take part in those systems. And even then you're still policed. So I was thinking when I looked through your essay, and well, no, I have a lot to say, but I'll end soon because I know so many people want to jump on this and ask questions, and I see how many people are on this call. So when I was thinking of the major themes, it seemed like private versus public, and private therefore less in family, and state neglect, obviously, and I also saw this, even though you didn't talk about this much, as an intersectional study. You know, and I'd like for you to talk about it if you see it that way, because you bring out feminism and what feminism helps us to see. And it helps us to see, I believe, not just that women are doing most of the work, so therefore they're devalued, but Black feminism helps us to see that devaluation happens and is compounded because of various reasons, race, sexuality, so forth. Then I think what's really brilliant about your work is that, and I'm focused on state neglect also, is caregivers are standing in for the state. And I was thinking that even in your love letter, that you were also standing in for the state, you know, providing, you know, mental health, providing support, providing all the things that don't happen and continue not to happen. So my questions, besides the ones I kind of went through kind of quickly, and I'm sure you get this all the time, how does the pandemic compound this? Because even basic care or appointments are being pushed back and so forth. And and doctors are leaving and care workers are stretched. Who is absent from your study? You know, who's not there that either you wished was there, or it changes maybe clear gaps that you can see that you either try to fill in or what have you. And what have you gained? Because obviously a lot of you is in this book, Gino, and you've tried to balance that. So what have you gained? How have you cared for yourself? Has it been in any ways both academically rewarding, but also fulfilling personally? And I have a million other questions about displays of affection, because that was one of the things you said. You hope this displays of affection is one of the ways that we can challenge the anti-body politics. But what are the other ways we can kind of challenge it and help to, you know, not always just stand into the state, but make the state more accountable? So I'll stop there. Yes.
Thank you, Sherie. I really appreciate that you read so closely and considered what I was writing. I am trying to figure out where to start. And I also am aware it's 4:45. I know we technically go to until 5-ish. So I'll try to be quick, and then we can see if other people want to. Is that a good plan, Michael?
That's a great plan.
Okay.
I think, you know, we have other folks who want to get on, but I think we're all want to hear what you have to say to Sherie's really fantastic discussion points.
Yeah. Well, I do think that, you know, one of the challenges, I just want to speak to the idea that this is structural, it's cultural, but it's also deeply personal. And one of the things I'm also trying to do in the book is balance pointing out the structural and the cultural, but also dealing in the real in terms of these are the actual challenges that are faced every single day. And it may be like, it may have to do with not being able to transfer from a bed to a chair, and that is a story worth telling, right? That is a personal and real phenomenon that does challenge caregivers, and that we have to kind of balance all this with the reality and the tragedy that is often progressive and degenerative diseases that people die from, and that we have to talk about that too. It can't just all be floating up here in this, here's the politics of disability, but here's the actual heartbreak that happens too. And I'm trying to figure out how to convey a way to hold both of those as true at the same time, because they are, and they're profound. And I don't want to denigrate the experience of that and the trauma of that. But I also don't want the trauma to stand in for everything, because so often trauma is deployed as a weapon to individualize things rather than look at the politics. So, you know, I'll say that. And I also want to say that, you know, we can talk, I wrote all of your questions down. We can definitely talk about that. But the other thing I want to speak to is the role of the pandemic. I had 2 very long interviews with every participant. I was funded by the Social Science Research Council precisely for a rapid response to COVID-19 grant. And I did have a whole set of questions around the pandemic, and just sort of broad strokes. I'll tell you that about 1/3 of the participants, their life was better because of the pandemic, because suddenly everything was online. Another 1/3, nothing changed because they were homebound anyway. And the other 1/3, things got drastically worse. Mm-hmm. And that's because, you know, physical therapy, for example, maintains people's level of functioning. And when you don't have physical therapy, you decline. And people were declining both physically and emotionally and psychologically with the profound isolation. Lots of tears over not being able to see grandchildren or other family members. So I would say those are the broad strokes.
Or not having access to internet, like my parents, you know, they would be like, how do I do this?
Well, one of my participants said that she suddenly became the ER. It was unsafe to go to the ER. So she was administering high doses of prednisone and monitoring fevers. And she's like, this could either kill him or it'll get better. And it's on me now, you know. This is the same person who fell asleep standing up in the elevator. So, I mean, I have like and I won't say much more other than I have every single person's stories seared in my brain. And this project was profoundly fulfilling, but also profoundly triggering and often at times unsafe for me, because I was reliving my own trauma. And I discovered a lot about my own trauma and having PTSD through this project, which I'm also grateful for. But that was really difficult. So all of that is, going in the book. So that's more to come.
Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Laura. And thank you, Sherie. That was great. What a fantastic conversation that you've started for us. So, Laura, I'm just going to jump right into. There's a whole bunch of comments and questions. There's a lot of people who are, I'll just signal right off the top, who are saying, like Sarah Willen, thank you, Laura. This was just exquisite and so deeply provocative. A lot of people are just thanking you for what is clearly, just a really moving and powerful presentation. But I'm going to go right down to some of the questions, some of the hard questions that you're getting to. And I'll start with a question from Litany, who says, out of curiosity, I'm wondering if you also discuss another layer of complexity from immigrant caregivers, as a high proportion of caregivers are sourced or immigrate to the US as laborers from the global South. In your work, do you also analyze ableism and sourcing labor from other countries to the US as created through a transnational lens? What might this say about how we are valuing or not care when it comes to also, when it is also built on immigrant labor, referencing contemporary history of migrant labor?
Yeah, I mean, that's such a good question. And care, like so many other things, has been, has had an uptake into financialized, capitalism, so that these are huge issues. And I, for the most part, do not discuss paid care work or care chains, mostly because the people that I spoke to were, I would say 90% of them did not have home health aides. And the ones that did lost them during the pandemic. And it was my intention at the outside that I should say something about intention and pandemic, right? Is that my intention for this project was actually to be much smaller. I was going to do only about 10 participants, and I was going to do them locally in New York City, where I was going to spend time and go hang out with people in their homes with a very small select few. Obviously, I couldn't do that. The pandemic hit and I could not go to people's homes. And so I ended up making this national and getting a national sample. It's just a different animal now that I got that. And because of that, I didn't have contact with paid care workers. None of the people that I visited had paid care workers. And if the people had paid care workers that I was talking to on Zoom, I could not access them. So it was a whole nother set of IRB situations. So it's certainly part of the backdrop, but it's not the focus. It's really focused on unpaid care work.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to go next to a question from Prakash, who says, thank you for such a powerful talk. I'm struggling to pose my question in the face of such an inspiring talk, but having said so, he says, here's my question. By focusing on, to paraphrase your words, our societal attitudes of ableism is responsible for the broken system of care, end quote, or paraphrase, does this framework of antibody politic give the body politic a free pass? Perhaps there are other parts of your work that address how effed up our effed up system breaks us, especially those carrying chronic conditions of various types. Thank you again for sharing such a moving piece of your work.
That's so interesting. To tell the truth, I came up with antibody politic because I was reading so much about the pandemic and antibodies. And this word antibody just kept coming up and was circulating. And I was like, wait a minute, and it just sort of, I read it differently one day when I heard it. And no, it does not stand in for, or it doesn't give a free pass to the body politic, as though, I think what you mean, Prakash, is that, am I saying that if we had a body politic that wasn't antibody, would everything be great? I think that might be what you're asking. And I would say it has taken me a long time to realize the foolishness of thinking that the state will take care of everyone. I think that's oftentimes I'm just like, what planet do I live on that I think the state is going to take care of everyone? So if that is what you mean by that question, that's how I'm interpreting it. I would say no free pass. And I'm dealing with and struggling with my own naivete, I suppose, coming into this.
Thank you. I'm going to go now to a question from Martha, just because she points us in a slightly different direction. She says, thank you, Laura, for such powerful ideas. This is Martha Cutter. Thanks so much for this beautiful talk. I have a writing question. Have you faced pushback from publishers, peer reviewers, or other scholars for combining personal and academic writing? I faced this with my last book via peer review, the demand to theory it up, so to speak. If you faced this, how did you negotiate it?
Thank you, Martha. I so appreciate you, and I appreciate you being here. That's such a good question. I was on a call recently with somebody, with a few other multiple senior sociologists who said, well, is this book going to count? Will this count? And my answer was, I don't care, because it's the book that's in my heart. And so I don't care. And I do think that what I've tried to do is shift more to general audience and public writing. I've been doing more op-eds, more essays that are, I have a personal essay that I'm trying to get placed. And I feel like the time is now to just talk openly about personal experience and to embrace the evocative, if you will. And I don't really mess with peer reviewers because I'm trying to get an agent, to get an editor, to get a trade press book. So I don't mean to sound flippant. It's just that I'm trying not to care particularly about this, because the people I want to talk to aren't peer reviewers. I hope they read this and I hope they get something from it, but I'm really focused on teaching myself how to write differently. And that's what this whole experience, one of the biggest struggles has been learning to write differently. So I'm just not submitting peer-reviewed work. And I don't know if that's like a bad choice, but it's the choice I need to make. And I'd be happy to talk with you offline about, navigating that in the future.
All right, so I'm going to go to a question from Doron Dorfman, who says, I'm just so excited about your new book, Laura. I was specifically moved by the love letter to your participants. Thank you for sharing it. I was wondering if and how parenthood fits into the topic of spousal caregiving. Do any of the couples you interviewed also have children? If so, how does disabled parenthood enter the picture? Thank you.
Thanks for being here, Doron. I'm so happy to see you, or not see you, but see your name in text. Yeah, that's interesting. Most of the people I interviewed were seniors. If they had children, they lived far away, did not live with them, and it was during a pandemic and they weren't seeing them. So a lot of that didn't enter in terms of the day-to-day. But I would also say that there were a couple of people who were younger that did have children. And their only way that they made things work was because they had, one person I can think of in particular had home and community-based services through Medicaid in California. But I would say children, for the most part, were not talked about too much, aside from, because again, everyone was older, aside from talking to their children about if they're going to help care for the other parent when they die. And that was often a difficult conversation. And I found that a lot of people talked about their children who lived far away as still staying connected, and that was like the most important thing to them in a lot of ways. But yeah, because of the age of my participants, the parenting part didn't, like the hands-on parenting stuff didn't come up as much as one might think.
All right. So I'm going to move to a question from Fumalaho Showers. I'm sorry, I apologize for butchering the pronunciation there. They say, thank you, Laura, for this moving, beautiful, and inspirational discussion. A lot of the discourse in Western approaches to care make a distinction between care for love versus care for money. In other words, one can argue that another layer of the devaluation of care has to do with the idea that care should be done for love, or ideas that the care performed by a family is too sacred or valuable to be sullied by money or base material considerations. I was struck by how much your discussion was framed by and motivated by love and care. How do we move towards an ethics of care that values love while at the same time calling for more benefits, practical benefits like adequate pay, health benefits, etc.?
Thank you, Fumi, for coming. Thank you for your question. This is such a huge part of the project, sort of in the background, because the love part is interesting because it comes up in a couple of ways. One is that, and I didn't talk about this today, but there's a whole sort of issue around spousal caregivers are very different from other family caregivers precisely because of the institution of heterosexual marriage and the assumption that two partners will do that. If there's two people partnered, one person will do everything for the other, and that it's like, oh, you're married, then you're fine. That person's going to take care of you. And it's this totally individualized, siloed experience rather than collective or communal. So the sort of operationalization of expectations around love and relationships come into play here. But the second piece is that a lot of the caregivers, let me see, I can think of one person in Arizona who received money from the state to provide care. And it was what let her not work and basically be paid to take care of her husband. No other participant in 21 other states had that option, or had, knew of that option. In that experience with that one person, I found that she was probably the most, I think, less pulled into 80 different directions because she was not working. She was working and she was being paid to take care of her husband. But that was a really important person to talk to, because this is something that I'm really curious about and that I need to know more, because I don't know. I think we should have, and maybe you and I can talk, interviews with people that are paid by the state to take care of their partners. And maybe we can talk about, we can hatch something fun to do together around that.
Okay, our last question is going to be from Mickey, who says, I join everyone here, Laura, in thanking you for a truly gorgeous project, gorgeously conceptualized and written, and in your intentions for the project and the brave, creative, effective leaps that you're willing to make. My question is there a place in this talk to talk about the ways that spousal or partner acts of care can themselves serve normalizing functions? Maybe we could say hetero or homo normalizing functions in their very privatization and the heroic care story. I'm thinking explicitly of US versus Windsor, the case that facilitated the legalization of same-sex marriage and was grounded in the story of Eddie Windsor's care for her partner with a degenerative illness. Of course, the key concern was the transmission of wealth, but the emotional weight of the case was in caregiving as a special act of spousal love. So she says, let's pretend there's a question mark here. So that's a lot. Do you care to comment?
I'll just say that I cannot tell you so many of my participants referenced the marriage vow of in sickness and in health. And that very clear sort of that they felt a mandate to do what they're doing. And in some ways, this institution provided cover for a state abandonment on this front. And I think that's a whole nother conversation. And I'm glad you brought up the Windsor case, because there was also this great article, which I'll share with you if you haven't read it, about how they brought together all these people from the community around them with young people to come and do collective care, particularly later in dementia, as dementia progressed. So I'll send you that. It's one of my favorite articles.
Well, please join me in thanking these two brilliant scholars and intellectuals, Laura and Sherie, for having this great conversation. Thank you so much, Laura, for the research and for the discussion today, Sherie. And thanks to all of you for joining us and participating. And Laura, you wanted to say something.
I just want to say one last thing, and that is I invited all of my participants today, and I know that some of them are here, and I see some of your chats, and I'm just thank you for coming. I really appreciate it.
Thank you all so much for being here for this really wonderful and powerful presentation. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Sherie. And I'll let you all get back to your evening's activities.